The sea was calmer than he remembered. Thomas Gray stood at the deck's edge, his gloved hand resting on the rail, staring toward the mist that veiled Greystone Point. The island rose from the water like the back of some ancient creature, rugged, cold, and silent. It had been 40 years since he'd last seen it. And 40 years since the night she died. The ferry's engine rumbled beneath his feet. Only 2 other passengers rode with him, a young couple more interested in their phones than the sea. He doubted they even knew the island's dark reputation. Greystone had long been abandoned, save for the lighthouse keeper and the occasional Coast Guard inspection. Thomas adjusted his cap. The salt air stung his eyes, but he didn't mind. At 72, he had learned to accept the sting of memory far more than that of the sea breeze. "First visit, sir?" the ferry captain asked, leaning from the cabin door. Thomas shook his head. "No. You could say I'm coming home." The captain raised a brow but said nothing more. Most men knew better than to pry into the past of sailors who looked like Thomas Gray, the kind of man whose eyes had seen too many horizons, and whose silences said more than his words. The dock creaked under his boots as he stepped off. The island smelled of seaweed and rust. Above, the lighthouse loomed tall, gray, unyielding, its glass eye staring blankly out to sea. Waiting near the base was a man in a heavy coat, his beard streaked with white. "Thomas Gray," he called, his voice echoing slightly in the fog. "Robert Hale," Thomas replied. "Didn't he think you'd still be here?" Robert chuckled, his breath forming mist. "Who else would keep the light burning? The government's been meaning to replace me with automation for 10 years, but I'm still standing. Come on up. The kettle's hot." The 2 men climbed the winding path. It was steep and lined with rock slick from sea spray. Thomas felt the years in his knees, but he pressed on. When they reached the keeper's cottage, Robert opened the door and ushered him inside. The warmth hit him instantly, the smell of tea, tobacco, and oil. The small room was crowded with maps, ship logs, and photos pinned to the wall. One photo caught his eye, a group of 4 young men standing proudly by the lighthouse, decades ago. He recognized every face. Himself. Robert. Alan. And Margaret. The name made his heart twist. They sat by the fire, mugs of tea in hand. The storm lamp hissed softly. "So," Robert said after a long silence, "you finally came back." Thomas nodded. "Couldn't he stay away forever? The sea has a way of calling you home. Or dragging you back to your ghosts," Robert muttered. Thomas glanced at him. "You still think it was an accident?" Robert's eyes flickered toward the window. "You mean Margaret's death?" The name hung between them like smoke. "That storm was fierce, Tom. The cliffside was slick. She slipped, that's what we told ourselves." Thomas leaned forward. "But you never believed it?" "I could see it in your face even then." Robert said nothing. The fire popped loudly, breaking the silence. Finally, Robert sighed. "There's something I should show you." He rose, went to a drawer, and pulled out an old, weathered envelope. The paper was brittle, yellowed by time. He handed it to Thomas. "I found it last year. Hidden behind a beam in the tower. I think it was meant for you." Thomas unfolded it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Margaret's delicate handwriting. The date July 14, 1985. The night she died. His hand trembled as he read, "Tom. If you ever come back to the lighthouse, know that what happened wasn't what it seemed. There are things you were never told, things Robert swore we'd keep quiet. But I can't live with it any longer. When the tide turns, I'll tell you everything. If something happens to me, look beneath the light. Thomas looked up slowly. You found this behind a beam? Robert nodded. Last winter. Never had the courage to open it myself. Thomas folded the note, his pulse steady but cold. Look beneath the light, he murmured. What the hell does that mean? Robert gave a weary shrug. Could be she hid something. Could be the ramblings of a woman afraid of a storm. No, Thomas said quietly. Margaret wasn't afraid of the sea. She was afraid of something else. That night, as wind howled outside and waves crashed against the rocks, Thomas lay awake in the small guest cot. The letter lay on the bedside table, catching the faint glow from the lighthouse window above. He stared at it, remembering that last night the argument, the storm, the scream he never forgot. He left the island before dawn, too broken to stay. Alan had vanished soon after, and Robert had remained, the solitary keeper of both the light and the island's silence. Now, 40 years later, the silence was cracking. Just after midnight, Thomas rose. He couldn't sleep, not while the tower loomed outside, whispering old secrets. He took his coat and stepped into the cold. The wind bit at his face as he climbed the path toward the lighthouse. The beam swept across the black sea, rhythmic and lonely. Inside, the spiral staircase groaned under his boots. He climbed slowly, one hand brushing the damp wall. When he reached the top, he paused, breathing hard. The machinery ticked softly. The great lamp turned, its brass frame gleaming faintly in the moonlight. He looked down. Beneath the light, a metal grate covered a small compartment below the floorboards, one he'd never noticed before. He knelt, pried it open, and reached inside. His fingers touched something cold, a small wooden box, sealed with rusted hinges. Inside was a single object. A locket. He opened it and froze. Inside, a photograph, Margaret's smile, and beside her, a man's face he hadn't expected to see. Alan. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the sea flat and grey as steel. Thomas stood by the window of the cottage, the locket heavy in his palm. The photograph burned in his mind, Margaret's radiant smile, her hand resting on Alan's shoulder. Alan. The man everyone believed had drowned 3 days after her death. Thomas had been at the search himself, the overturned boat, the empty life jacket, the sea swallowing every trace. No body had ever been found. Now, 4 decades later, the man's face stared at him from a locket hidden beneath the lighthouse. Why would Margaret keep that, and why hide it? Robert was at the stove, frying bacon, humming an old sailor's tune. Sleep at all? He asked without turning. Thomas placed the locket on the table between them. Robert's hand froze midair. The humming stopped. Where did you get that? Beneath the light, Thomas replied quietly. Exactly where she said. Robert slowly sat down, eyes fixed on the photo. I'd forgotten that face. I don't think you did, Thomas said. Robert's jaw tightened. Careful, old friend. The sea may forgive a man his sins, but I'm not the sea. Thomas leaned forward. You knew something, Robert. That letter proves she was planning to tell me the truth. Tell me what really happened that night. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hiss of the stove. Then Robert sighed heavily. You remember how it was back then, Margaret, Alan, you, me. Four fools running the supply station like it was our own little world. But things changed when Alan got greedy. Greedy? Robert nodded. He started selling off fuel shipments, pocketing the difference. The Coast Guard suspected, but couldn't he prove it? Margaret found out. Said she'd tell the authorities if he didn't stop. That night, there was a fight out by the cliff. And she fell, Thomas said bitterly. Robert's eyes flickered. She fell, or was pushed. I never saw it happen. Only heard the scream. And Alan? Gone by dawn. Boat missing. They said the current took him. Thomas studied Robert's face. There was sincerity in his tone, or perhaps just weariness. He couldn't tell which. You should be told me, Thomas said. Robert gave a humorless smile. And what would that have changed? You were half mad with grief. Maybe I thought you'd follow him into the sea. Dash dash. They ate in silence after that. The lighthouse loomed outside the window like a sentinel guarding its secrets. By midday, Thomas decided to explore the island. He walked the cliffs, boots crunching over gravel. The air smelled of kelp and iron. Every corner of Greystone carried echoes, laughter by the shore, the sound of Margaret's voice calling from the tower, the crash of the sea below. He reached the edge of the rocks where the accident had happened. The wooden fence had long since rotted away. He stared down the drop 30 feet to jagged stone and swirling water. Then he noticed something strange, fresh footprints in the wet sand below. He frowned. No one was supposed to be here but Robert, and the island hadn't had visitors in weeks. Dash dash. By evening, the fog had thickened again. Thomas returned to the cottage to find the door slightly open. Inside, the fire was out, and Robert was nowhere to be seen. Robert, he called. No answer. He stepped further inside, then stopped. On the table lay a wet raincoat, and next to it, a ship's logbook, open to the date July 14, 1985. His pulse quickened. The entry was written in Robert's hand. Alan arrived unexpectedly. Storm approaching. He demanded fuel and supplies. Margaret insisted we refuse him. Argument between them grew violent. Heard shouting near the cliff. Later only Margaret's scarf found. Alan gone. Can't tell Thomas. He wouldn't understand. Thomas exhaled shakily. So Robert had known more. But why keep this from him for 40 years? He turned another page, this one dated only a week ago. Saw a light offshore last night. Small boat drifting near the cove. Thought I heard a voice. Sounded like Alan. A creak from behind made him turn. Robert stood in the doorway, his face pale. You shouldn't have read that, he said softly. Thomas closed the book. So it's true, then. He's alive. Robert rubbed his temples. I don't know what's true anymore. Last winter, I heard a knock at the tower door. When I opened it, nothing but sea mist. But someone had left this. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a brass compass, its cover engraved with initials, A.H. Alan Hale. Thomas stared at it. He's here, isn't he? Robert's gaze drifted toward the cliffs. Maybe he never left. Dash dash. That night, neither man spoke much. They sat in the flickering glow of the fire, listening to the wind moan around the tower. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes followed them through the mist. Near midnight, he heard a sound outside, a faint tapping against the window. He rose, stepped closer, and froze. Through the fogged glass, A shadow moved tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. For a split second, the beam from the lighthouse swept across the face. It was unmistakable. Alan. Then the figure vanished into the night. Thomas burst through the door, shouting into the fog. Alan! Alan Hale! Nothing but the wind replied. Robert appeared behind him, holding a lantern. Tom, what are you doing? He's out there. I saw him. Robert looked uneasy. That's impossible. He'd be in his 70s now. No one could survive out here this long. Thomas's voice was low. Then tell me how his compass ended up in your pocket. Robert didn't answer. The next morning, Robert was gone. His bed unmade, his jacket missing, the lighthouse door left ajar. Thomas searched the island for hours, no trace. Only the endless crash of waves and the mournful cry of gulls. When he climbed the lighthouse again, something new awaited him. On the metal console near the lamp, a fresh sheet of paper fluttered under the beam's light, written in shaky ink, "You were never supposed to come back. Meet me by the cliffs at dusk. Come alone." No signature. Thomas stood there for a long moment, heart pounding. The handwriting was familiar, uneven, almost trembling, but he couldn't decide whose it was. Robert S. Alan S. or Margaret S. mimicked by someone who knew too much. The sea roared below, as if whispering the same question he'd asked himself for 40 years, what really happened that night? The island was quieter than he remembered it had ever been. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Thomas Gray stood outside the lighthouse at dawn, the mysterious note still folded in his pocket. Meet me by the cliffs at dusk. Come alone. He'd barely slept. The words haunted him through the night, the idea that Alan might still be alive, or that someone wanted him to believe so. Either way, it meant one thing: the past wasn't buried. He brewed coffee on the old stove and stared out the window at the gray horizon. The fog was lifting, revealing the jagged coastline and the faint outline of the dock below. Robert's boat was still there, untouched. Where, then, had the man gone? Thomas opened the ship's log again. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. Nothing unusual. But tucked between the pages, he found something: a photograph. It showed 3 people standing by the lighthouse door: Robert, Margaret, and a third figure partly cropped out of frame. Only half a face, but the profile was unmistakable. Alan Hale. Older than in the photo from the locket, which meant it was taken after the night he was presumed dead. Thomas's breath caught. So he did come back, he whispered. He pocketed the photo and stepped outside. The air was cold and sharp. He walked the path to the cliff slowly, scanning the ground, every footprint, every stone. The wind carried faint echoes from the sea, like whispers just beyond hearing. At the cliff's edge, he stopped. Something gleamed among the rocks below. He climbed down carefully, gripping the slick stone. The object was wedged in a crevice, a metal flask, its surface corroded by salt. He pried it free and turned it over. The initials were still visible: R.H. Robert Hale. He unscrewed the cap. Inside, dry, but folded tightly within, was a strip of paper, stained and faded. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. Only a few words were legible: "He came back for it. She hid it in the wall behind the beam. Don't trust." The rest was gone, erased by time and sea water. Thomas's pulse raced. Behind the beam. That was where Margaret's letter had been found. But what was it? Back at the lighthouse, the interior felt colder than before, almost hostile. He climbed the spiral staircase, stopping at each landing to examine the wooden beams. The structure creaked faintly in the wind. Near the top, he noticed something odd, a section of the wall where the wood was newer than the rest, as if repaired not long ago. He tapped it lightly. Hollow. He pried it open with a pocket knife. Behind the plank, wrapped in cloth, was a small leather-bound ledger. He opened it and froze. It wasn't just a log book. It was Alan's journal. The first entries were routine weather notes, supply counts, observations about the light. Then, halfway through, the tone changed. June 30, 1985, Robert knows. He's been following me to the storehouse. If he tells Margaret, everything's ruined. I never meant for her to find out. July 10, Margaret confronted me. Said she'd go to the Coast Guard. I begged her to wait until I could fix it. She said she didn't trust me anymore. July 14, storm coming. She says she'll tell Tom everything tonight. If she does, I'll lose everything. That was the last entry. Thomas stared at the page, his throat dry. He flipped to the back, but someone had torn out several pages. The edges were ragged, fresh compared to the rest. Someone had removed them recently. A sound made him turn, the faint creak of the lower door. He froze, listening. Another sound, footsteps on the stairs. Slow. Heavy. Robert, he called. No reply. He extinguished his lantern and moved behind the mechanism, waiting. The steps grew louder, echoing in the narrow chamber. Then a figure appeared in the doorway, tall, wearing a slick coat, face hidden by shadow. Thomas gripped the edge of the brass frame. Who's there? The man stepped forward, and the rotating light swept across his face. For an instant, Thomas felt his heart stop. It was Alan Hale, older, gaunt, eyes hollow but unmistakable. Alan, Thomas breathed. You're alive. Alan's voice was rough, quiet. Alive, if that's what you'd call it. He glanced around the chamber, then at the open journal in Thomas's hands. His expression hardened. You shouldn't have found that. You faked your death, Thomas said. Why? Alan let out a tired laugh. Because dead men aren't arrested. Robert made sure of that. Robert. He blamed me for Margaret's fall, Alan said bitterly. Said I killed her. But he was the one who pushed her. She found out about him, about the black market fuel runs he'd been running for years. He killed her to keep her quiet. Then turned it on me. Thomas's head swam. That's not what Robert told me. Of course not, Alan said. He's been guarding his secret for 40 years. But I came back to finish it. Before Thomas could respond, a sharp sound echoed from below, the slamming of the lower door. Alan's eyes flicked toward the stairs. He's here, he hissed. You have to choose, Tom, believe me, or believe him. The footsteps returned faster this time, heavier. Robert burst into the chamber, rain pouring from his coat. His face was pale, eyes wild. Step away from him, Tom. He shouted. He's dangerous. Alan laughed bitterly. Still the same liar. Tell him, Robert. Tell him what you did to her. Enough. Robert raised a revolver, old, weathered, but steady in his hand. You don't know what you're talking about. Thomas stepped between them. Put it down, Robert. We can talk about this. Talk. Robert's voice trembled. After all these years, after everything I buried. Alan lunged. A shot rang out. The echo filled the tower, mingling with the crashing of the waves outside. Dash dash. When the smoke cleared, Alan was slumped against the railing, clutching his arm. Blood stained his sleeve. Robert's hand shook violently, the revolver slipping from his grip. Thomas kicked it away, pressing a cloth to Alan's wound. "You damn fool," he muttered. Robert stumbled back, gasping. He was going to kill me. Alan laughed through the pain. "You've been saying that for 40 years. Thomas looked from one to the other, realization dawning like lightning. "There's something neither of you are saying," he whispered. "Margaret, didn't he just find out about the smuggling, did she? There was more." Both men fell silent. Finally, Robert looked away. She was in love with one of us." Alan's jaw tightened. "And it wasn't he, you." Dash dash. The wind howled through the open window. The light turned, casting long shadows across the walls. Thomas stared at the two men, old ghosts of a tragedy reborn, and felt the ground shift beneath the weight of truth. He had come to find answers, but now he wasn't sure he wanted them. Outside, the storm was rising again. And beneath its roar, somewhere in the darkness below, something metallic clanged as if the sea itself were trying to speak. The rain stopped by the time Arthur stepped out into the courtyard. The air smelled of salt and secrets. The old fountain murmured softly, a sound like the past whispering. Inside the manor, Inspector Darrow was finishing a call. "They found the stolen car near the cliffs." "Empty." Arthur nodded. "Then he's still here." They turned toward the library, the only room where all mysteries seemed to end. Inside, Eleanor sat by the fire, her shawl draped neatly, her eyes far too calm. "Inspector," she said softly. "I suppose you've come for me." Arthur leaned against the mantel. "You're the last piece, Eleanor. We know now Thomas didn't die by accident. You planned it, years ago, after the wedding." She looked at him, her lips trembling into a faint, wistful smile. "I planned nothing. I only waited. He did the rest himself." Arthur placed the small brass key, the one found in the clock tower, on the table. This opened the hidden cellar, the one where the documents were kept. "Your letters to Thomas, your threats. That's what you burned." Eleanor closed her eyes. "I loved him, Arthur. But love rots when it's buried in lies. He was going to leave me for her, and then he slipped, drunk on the balcony. I didn't push him. I simply didn't stop him." The silence was sharp as glass. The inspector wrote something in his notebook. Arthur looked at the fire, at the way it danced and swallowed the last bits of truth. "And Edmund," he asked, "he helped you hide the rest?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "He pitied me. He thought the house should keep its dignity. Now you've ruined that too." Arthur sighed. "No, Eleanor. I've set it free." As she was led away, he lingered by the window. The sea stretched endlessly, indifferent. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed one solemn and slow. He picked up the last letter from the desk. It was addressed to him, written in Thomas's hand. "If you're reading this, Arthur, then the truth has found its way through the cracks. Take care of Eleanor. She was never cruel, only lonely." Arthur folded it gently, his eyes heavy with the kind of sorrow only age understands. "Lonely," he murmured. "A terrible motive, and the most human one." Outside, the first light of dawn touched the Manor's grey stones. The rain returned, soft this time, washing everything clean, even the ghosts.